right, welcome everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute. We have a number of people signing in right now, but thank you all for joining. All right, we have a lot to talk about today, so why don't we get started? Welcome everyone to the UHI or Urban Harbors Institute webinar series. My name is Kim Starbuck. I am a senior research associate at the Urban Harbors Institute. And the Urban Harbors Institute is a research institute that is located at UMass Boston. We are in the School for the Environment at UMass Boston. We have been around since 1989, and we primarily help assist governments and communities with addressing issues that they have associated with harbors and coastal areas. We do a lot of research, we do planning, community engagement, and we also do quite a bit of marine debris work. So we wanted to organize this webinar to talk more about specifically marine debris research and then also community engagement. This webinar will be recorded, and so you will be able to access this after if you want to go for another round and watch again, or if you want to share with others. And so the purpose of this webinar is to share research that is currently occurring or just recently occurred at UMass Boston, specifically about marine debris, to help raise awareness, make connections, and hopefully in the end, result in a reduction of marine debris in our waterways. The format of this will be, first we'll have a presentation by Shannon Hogan at Urban Harbors Institute, then Juanita Urban-Rich, who is a professor with the School for the Environment, and then Nick Warner, who is with the Urban Harbors Institute as well. So we will go through a few presentations and then have question and answer at the end. We'll also, after each presentation, give the opportunity for 1 to 2 short questions if you wanted to ask something about what somebody just presented. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat box, or also at the end, we will open it up and allow you to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask in person. That being said, please keep yourselves on mute while the presenters are presenting. And I believe that is all. So now we can jump into our first presentation, which is by Shannon Hogan.
All right. Thanks, Kim. All right, so I'm Shannon Hogan. I work for the Urban Harbors Institute at UMass Boston. I'm a research associate there. I also completed my master's at UMass Boston in August of 2022. I just want to thank you all for joining us today. For my portion of the webinar, I'm just going to give a brief overview of what marine debris is, its origins and impacts, followed by some of my work of marine debris research on Nantucket Island. And I apologize, this admit view waiting room is showing up on my screen, but I don't know how to get rid of it. So just bear with me with that. All right, so what is marine debris? I figured most of you probably know, some of you may not, but I just wanted to share this formal definition by NOAA so we're all on the same page. So marine debris is defined as any persistent solid material that is manufactured or processed and directly or indirectly, intentionally or unintentionally disposed of or abandoned into the marine environment or the Great Lakes. And marine debris can come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, compositions. There's wood, metal, plastic, rubber. It can be small consumer items, large shipwrecks, housing materials, cars, fishing gear. Essentially anything that humans have manufactured and use as a good that ends up in the ocean or marine ecosystem. Plastic is the most common type of marine debris and represents approximately 80% of all marine debris found in the oceans. Humans have produced more than 8.3 billion metric tons of plastic since its large-scale production began in the 1950s. It's ubiquitous in the environment, specifically in the marine environment, and has been found in all the major ocean basins and even the most remote parts of the world's oceans. It has been found on shorelines, open waters, and on the sea floor as well. So how does plastic end up in the marine environment? Well, most of the plastic that is in the marine environment currently has come from land. There are a variety of sources though, but scientists have estimated that 60 to 95% of plastic debris in the ocean originates from land-based sources. So this can be from, coastal communities, coastal towns and cities. Their plastic debris that's right on the waterfront can easily make its way to the adjacent ocean. For more inland areas, land-based plastic debris can be distributed through river systems, making their way down into the open ocean. There's also other sources of marine debris and plastic, such as lost or derelict fishing gear, and this can be both from commercial fishing or recreational fishing. There was a recent study published by scientists with the Nature Conservancy and the University of California that revealed more than 100 million pounds of plastic enter the oceans each year from industrial fishing gear. And then there's also obviously shipping that happens, and that could also lead to plastic litter. So there are many negative consequences from the intrusion of plastic debris into the marine environment, much of which are still being studied today. It can be ingested by marine life or lead to entanglement. It can result in economic losses, especially in areas that are dependent on tourism. As you can see, there's a picture of a beach covered in trash in Bali, Indonesia, and no one wants to sit on trash. So that could reduce your amount of visitors that are coming to your coastal towns. Also, lost and derelict fishing gear can degrade sensitive bottom habitats, and also continue to catch species known as ghost fishing. And this can result in lost catch opportunities. Also, if you're losing lines, nets, traps, you're going to have to pay money to replace those items. Another major consequence of marine debris and plastic debris specifically is the conversion of macro, so large plastic debris that's greater than 5 millimeters in size, to microplastic debris. So this happens when larger debris is weathered from processes such as wind. You have UV radiation, that's termed photodegradation, also abrasion from wave currents and sediment. So these macroplastics become very brittle and they start to break down and fragment. And they turn into these tiny small particles known as microplastics. So there are various types of microparticles, and I'm using the term microparticles now because they could be synthetic or non-synthetic. They can range in size from 1 to 5,000 microns, and they can be categorized in several different ways. One is composition. So you have, your basic polymer backbone, polyethylene, polypropylene. Those are all different types of chemical plastic polymers. Another is color, and often what is commonly done is shape. All of these are relevant and may affect the fate of a plastic particle. There are also primary and secondary microplastics. Primary being plastics that are intentionally manufactured as small, so your nurdles, also your microbeads that are used in cosmetics. And there are also secondary microplastics, which, as I mentioned before in my previous slide, fragment from larger debris. Another group are fibers, which is a very important group because they are often the most common form of microplastic pollution in the marine environment. These include thin threads, filaments, and/or line from textiles, ropes, fishing gear, and cigarettes. They can be fully synthetic, semi-synthetic, or natural, being derived from cellulose, such as wool or cotton. So now I'm going to transition a little bit and move into my research that I did for my master's with Dr. Juanita Urban-Rich at the Microplastics Lab at UMass Boston. And the purpose of my research was to identify the occurrence and abundance of microparticles on Nantucket Island through analyzing seawater and intertidal beach sediment. And this was the first study to create a baseline of microparticle data on Nantucket Island. And Dr. Urban-Rich will talk more about how this research is ongoing. So just to give some background, Nantucket Island is located 30 miles off Cape Cod, Massachusetts. It's home to about 15,000 long-term residents, During the summer month, that population increases to 80,000. So that's quite a lot of people. The economy is based heavily dependent on tourism and the service industry. Nantucket Harbor is also a commercial fishing port and home to the last wild-based scallop fishery in the United States. So for this research, we studied 3 beach sites on the island. The first being Surfside Beach, which is located on the south side of the island, open to the ocean, to the open Atlantic. It's a popular beach for beachgoers and swimmers and surfers in the summertime. There is also high wave energy here. Madaket Beach was the second site located on the east part of the island. It's calm, semi-enclosed, and it's located on the Nantucket Sound side. There's also a harbor with moorings in the area where we were sampling. The final site was Nantucket Harbor Beach, which is located very close to the center of town. There's commercial ferries going in and out of here during the summertime and also during the off-season, fishing boats, commercial and recreational. So it's a very active area, and it's also a semi-enclosed environment, as you can see right here. So as I said before, we looked at seawater and intertidal beach sediment. This figure is showing you the average concentration of microparticles in the seawater at the 3 different study sites during the 4 different sampling times, which are located on the x-axis. And there is variation in the amount of microparticles found in the seawater at all of the sites and between the different sample dates. This is looking at Nantucket intertidal beach sediment at the 3 different sites. Similar to the last graph, the sample dates are on the x-axis, and as you can see, there is also variation between concentrations of microparticles in the sand between sites and also between the sampling dates. I have done some work looking at the composition of microparticles in the beach sand, and at this point, common synthetic fibers and types that I found include polyester, olefin, which is often polypropylene or polyethylene. So we also wanted to examine the relationship between beach sediment and seawater microparticle concentrations at each beach, and what we found suggests that environmental influences the distribution of microplastics at the sites. So looking up here, we can see this is Surfside in purple. There's a negative relationship between the microparticle concentration in the sediment and seawater, which is indicative of the mixing and resuspension that happens between the sediment and the water at this site due to high wave energy. In contrast, if we look at Nantucket Harbor in green, this is a positive relationship, which means when there's high concentrations of microparticles in the seawater, there's high concentrations of microparticles in the sediment and vice versa. And this likely reflects the calmer water and depositional nature of the harbor. Madaket, which is right here in blue, there was no significant relationship between the sediment and water concentrations. And that could be because this beach is transitional and also subject to both deposition and mixing. So kind of a mix of Surfside and Nantucket Harbor Beach. We also wanted to determine if microparticles were entering the food web of Nantucket Island by examining their presence in gray seal scat. So we looked at a total of 19 seal scat samples that were collected in July 2019, November 2019, and January of 2020. And we've got these at Great Point on Nantucket Island, located in the Koskata-Coatue Wildlife Refuge. So fiber particles were found in 100% of the samples, as you can see here indicated in this greenish blue color. And there were also microplastics, so hard fragments, foams, and films found in 95% of the samples, so 18 out of 19 samples. These samples are still being processed to deduce the composition of microparticles, but up to this point, I have found common types of microplastics, including polyester, olefin again, and then ethyl vinyl acetate, which is a naturally elastic copolymer that is found in surfboards, flip-flops, foam boards, etc. And before ending, I just wanted to acknowledge our funding entities and also the other scientists who helped me with this research and other students while at UMass Boston. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Shannon. So I wanted to open it up before we move on to Dr. Juanita Urban-Rich. Wanted to open up for a question or two. If folks want to write a question in the chat or raise their hand, We can have 1 to 2 questions for Shannon now. And then again, at the end, we'll have about 15 minutes for questions. Okay, I see Laura has a question. So go ahead, Laura.
Thank you, Shannon. I wanted to just make sure I heard you correctly. You were talking about the contribution of derelict fishing gear to marine debris annually, and I think you said 100 million something pounds, tons?
Yeah, I said 100 million pounds. Let me go back just to make sure as well. 100 million pounds of plastic
Contributed from derelict fishing gear, and that was the
from
report.
industrial derelict fishing gear.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. I'm gonna look up that paper.
Yeah, it's pretty recent. I just saw it actually about a month or
Focados
so
para a construção
ago.
civil há 15.804. Ok.
Sorry, go ahead, Shannon.
Oh yeah, I was just saying, yeah, I saw that paper about a month ago, so you should be able to find it pretty easily, Laura.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Shannon. Great presentation.
Thank you.
All right, is there one more question? All right. Well, if you do have a question, you can save it for later on. And so now we will transition over to Dr. Urban Rich. She has a presentation also talking about her marine debris research at UMass Boston.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you, Shannon, for your presentation. Is everybody seeing it okay?
Yes,
Great.
It looks good.
So I wanted to talk to you about some of the research work going on in my lab, covering just a variety of different things from microplastic and fiber abundance, its occurrence in different places, and some of its impacts. So you heard a little bit of Shannon's work, but I want to take a minute. In plastics, once they fragment down to these small microplastics, which are defined as plastic less than 5 millimeters, are found in a lot of different reservoirs. Different polymers have different densities, so they may float, they may sink, they get biofilms on them, so some of the floating ones start to sink. They can be ingested by animals and potentially moved around in food webs. So in my lab, we use this aspect of the fact that microplastics are in the air, the water, the sediment, and different organisms to try to get an idea of how much is around here and what types. So on Nantucket Island, building on the study that Shannon did, different graduate students are part of this. We've continued the work beyond what Shannon was talking about through March of 2022. So here in this column, you're seeing surface water, and over here is the intertidal sand sediment concentrations. And what we're doing right now is we're looking and trying to understand what's causing this variation in the different harbors, and can we figure out a really good solid baseline for what the microplastic and fiber pollution levels are now, so that in time we could go back and double check it. Also, one of my graduate students, Nick, has been looking at atmospheric deposition on microplastics at 2 stations out on Nantucket. And another graduate student, Reese, is building on this idea of atmospheric microplastics to potentially see, are they marine mammals breathing these in? What's the potential impact of some of these atmospheric microplastics? We've also done a bunch of work in Boston Harbor itself. This was work from my graduate student, Katie Tobin, where we did some cruises in the summer of 2018, looking at just fiber concentrations in the surface water. And the only point I want to make right here with this graph is that concentrations vary. Red is low concentrations and green is higher concentrations. We were using the surface water bottle grab method. There are different methods when you study microplastics, and the different methods give you default to slightly different results and different answers. So using the water grab sample, you're not getting large volumes, but you're also not forcing the water through any net or any mesh and potentially losing things. So it also defaults to getting fibers very well. So what we found was fibers ranged on surface waters from 5 to 48 fibers per liter. And these fibers include both natural fibers like cotton or wool, semi-synthetic, and synthetic fibers. And other studies in other labs have found that your natural fibers, your semi-synthetic, and your synthetic are all potentially toxic and harmful to marine animals. So for us, we're looking at total fiber distribution. We also use some of the oysters in Boston Harbor. Since they're suspension feeders, they're another way of kind of collecting and seeing what's there and kind of integrating over a longer time period for what might be present. And when we're looking at oysters here, we walked out, we collected nearshore oysters. We rinsed off the outside of it very well. We shucked it and we took the whole animal inside. So this also includes any pseudofeces and other material around the oyster. So these concentrations we're reporting here reflect that, not just what's internal in the animal. So here we got fibers ranging from 0 to 180 per oyster. Higher concentrations tended to be in the areas around the Mystic River and the Neponset River. And again, these fibers included both natural, semi-synthetic, and synthetic fibers. Synthetic are your petroleum-based fibers. Your semi-synthetic are more your cellulose-based fibers. So this work is ongoing right now. COVID kind of slowed us down doing the composition, but looking at the boat cruises, so I've got your map here and looking at the composition in the surface water, what we're seeing is that there's natural fibers, that's the green portion. There's the cellulose acetate, the semi-synthetic fibers, and some of your plastics. And then you have a bunch of synthetics, and some of the most common synthetics are your nylon, your polyester, and some of your acrylic fibers. And down here, we're looking at oysters, and I've tried to draw arrows from the water samples that are very close to where we collected these oysters so that you could kind of see, okay, what's in the surface and what's in these oysters. And as the tide is coming in and out, the surface water may be being exposed to these oysters. And again, you see there's natural fibers in some of the oysters. There's a semi-synthetic in all of them, but there's also a greater variety of synthetic fibers. So the semi-synthetic cellulose acetates are your dominant type, both in the surface water and in the oysters. Your oysters have this greater diversity where you have nylon, you have polystyrene, you have acrylic fibers, and polyester being common. And in many ways, what is found in the oysters is similar to what's in the surface waters. Additionally, UMass Boston is located here on this point here, and this is Savin Hill Cove. Around here, so you've got the university, you've got all the students, you've got Morrissey Boulevard here that floods during high tides, so potentially washing through. You've got boats potentially coming through here. I had another master's student who was looking at, okay, we know how much is floating on the surface, but for plankton, the first major step in the food web, what are they able to consume? So she was looking at the amount of microplastics at 1 meter depth and looking at the size range that was most easily consumed by the zooplankton. So the 63 to 300 micron fraction of the microplastics. And what we saw over the course of the year is the average concentration was 9 microplastics or microparticles per liter. There's variation on different months. Some months are a little higher, some are a little lower. If we look at just the synthetics, the primary things were, again, polyester and your nylons. Fibers made up 60 to 90% of the particles. Your polyester and your nylons, as I said, were the most abundant. Some of your polystyrene that we found was the much denser foam, and the PVC and the polyethylene might have been construction related, and some of the other polyester or polyethylene construction related. Polyester may be related to the car tires and the flooding of Morrissey. That's not totally confirmed yet. Additionally, we were looking at the Charles River. So Shannon was talking about rivers as being a way to move or transport material, debris from inland out into the ocean. So I had a graduate student, Lee, who was looking at the Charles River from the head of the river up in Hopkinton, all the way down to the mouth here in Boston. And we did it at 4 different times of the year. And what you can see is that along the river, there's different concentrations. There are certain areas that are hotspots throughout the year. Generally speaking, the concentration increases as you move down the river. So likely just to transport it. And there's the potential of export into the harbor using water gauge rates of 40 to 960 million particles per day. Again, these are similar rates to what has been found in New York Harbor from the Hudson River. And again, this is looking at surface water using, again, the water graph method. So we've got microparticles, microplastics, microfibers in different water sources and sands as well. So the question is, where do these go? So far, we've found them in the wild, in different organisms, and in the lab, we've done studies with larval stages of shellfish, and we're seeing that they're in your oysters, in your seal scat, in the cold water corals around here, in plankton. So the question comes, what does it matter? And that's really where a lot of the field of microplastic research is at right now, and the big question that we have. And you have to think about it for these particles. There's the physical nature. They're an object that's being ingested. So there's that physical aspect. So your fibers, your films, they're pretty malleable, and they'll bend and they'll move in different ways, but they also might wrap around different tiny little cilia or legs or appendages of some of these small animals or creatures. Some of your harder fragments are going to be blocking and causing potentially abrasions. But there's also that chemical aspect of particles. So plastics are not just that polymer that they're made of. They're not just polystyrene or PVC. There's all these other additives put into them or dyes that are put into them, and other non-intentional chemicals that get into them as well, and chemicals that absorb onto them in the environment. So that aspect as well is relevant. And then there's the aspect of perceptions. How do we view plastic pollution? How is it impacting us, from everything from economics to health? So we've tried to do a little bit of work on this. So looking kind of at that physical aspect, I had an REU student who did a really great experiment that we also built on, that was looking at whether the cold water corals around here, Astrangia, could ingest microplastics. And this was a laboratory study where, if you want to on your own, you can follow this link and you'll see the video where you can see that the corals actually do ingest these plastics. And what we found is we fed them microplastics, then we gave them brine shrimp eggs. We moved them to clean water where there was no plastic. And what you found was you had this reduction in the amount of the actual types of food that they should be eating after they had been exposed to the microplastics. We also found that there was a preferential ingestion, like if you gave them both brine shrimp eggs and plastic, they preferred the plastic. So preferential ingestion decreases in feeding on the real things, the things that will give them the energy they need for metabolism and growth. We also coated some of these plastics with E. coli, and we could see the bacteria being transferred internally into the corals, then sloughing off, and within a week these corals were dying from the transfer of this harmful bacteria into them. In another study, another graduate student, Charles, was looking at how can plastics, could they be like a vector for some of these other contaminants of emerging concern? So gemfibrozole has been detected in Nantucket Sound. It's a pharmaceutical that's used for heart conditions. So in the laboratory, we exposed base scallop larvae to the gemfibrozole and to polystyrene beads coated with the gemfibrozole. And what we found was there was a reduction in the survival at these extremely low concentrations of gemfibrozole, well below what's detected in the environment. So the plastic, or at least the polystyrene, can serve as a sponge and a vector that can lead to increased mortality and can be a way of transporting things that are at low concentrations into organisms, giving them a potentially higher dose. So I said plastics are these cocktail of a whole bunch of different chemicals. And other studies, other labs are looking at the leachate, what's coming out of these materials. So I had an REU last summer, Andre, who took some plastic debris we found on the beaches of Nantucket, leached it for a while, and then exposed it to Hyalella embryos, which is a amphipod that's used in EPA for toxicology studies. Katie Johnson, a graduate student, is going to be building on this work. But what we found was with some of these different debris, so these are mylar balloons, frisbees, nylon fishing line, polypropylene rope. We also took all the microplastics, we extracted them out of a kilogram of sand and leached those. And what we found was there were abnormalities, and there was actually also deaths occurring. So this is a healthy embryo. You see its head, its eye spot, its nice back and legs here. This is an embryo that doesn't have legs, doesn't have a head. So you start to see what some of the different abnormalities that can happen and how these can potentially lead to death of organisms. So again, we're going to expand this work and try to understand better what's coming out. Everything from our phthalates coming out in that material that's surrounding the oyster, not within the oyster, but in those pseudofeces. Is it leaching out of various weathered debris or from fishing gear, and what might that mean for different organisms? We're also interested in that trophic transfer. So Shannon did some initial work where we found that it was present in seal scats. And another Shannon is building on this work, and she has a much larger data set looking at scat from 2017 all the way through 2022. And Jack White, who's an undergrad honors student, is helping and working with her. And we're looking at their diet from otoliths as well as some molecular DNA barcoding, and trying to see if there's correlations and relationships between what they're eating and the amount of microplastics and microfibers in the scat from the seal. And as Kim talked about with urban harbors, there's also a human side to all of this that I'm also interested in, and we try to do in my lab as well. We've done workshops bringing different stakeholders that care about how plastics might interact, and we have these discussions talking to them about values and economic impacts of plastic or plastic debris. We've done some surveys with residents on Nantucket Island, trying to understand how they feel about plastic. And in this small initial survey, a large percentage of them were thinking that plastic debris is an environmental health risk on the island. We also have developed educational activities that we've done in classrooms and at science fairs and summer camps to try to bring more awareness of plastic debris, but also what are microplastics? How do they form? How do we study them? So there's plastic debris all around. This shows you some of the bigger macro debris that we found in my lab, the microplastics that we're finding. And a lot of this is forming from this breakdown of them. And overall, what we found in all these different places that we're looking, from the rivers to the harbors to surface seawater, fibers are the most prevalent type of microparticle debris. Synthetic particles, so the petroleum-based ones, are making up 13 to 62% of these particles. And synthetic and semi-synthetic together make up anywhere from 58 to 100% of the particles. And I do want to acknowledge that these are group projects. I can't do it by myself. My graduate students have been amazing and awesome doing this work, as well as a number of colleagues who have worked with me, and undergrads working, helping in the lab and helping all of us. And the work's been funded by UMass Boston, Remain Nantucket, Nantucket Land Council, and the National Science Foundation. So, thank you. We'll go back to that picture.
Great. Thank you, Juanita. That was really interesting. All right. I already see one hand raised. Is it Alicia?
Oh, yeah, Alicia. Yeah, thank you. Very interesting. What type of methodology did you use to qualify what type of plastic, like what type of polymer?
So we're using FTIR.
Okay.
So actually, touching down and getting the spectrum of them.
Thank you.
Yep.
Great. And I see another question in the chat. For the leachate embryo study, what are the concentration levels that you used for plastic leaching? Are those based on mass volume or count/volume?
So for the balloon, the frisbee, fishing line, and rope, we took 1 gram of the plastic material and leached it in a liter of water. For a few of them, I'm only showing you results. We also did it for a lower concentration. For microplastics, I took 1 kilogram of sand and did a density separation, extracting all the microplastics from that kilogram. So there I have a number. I don't have a weight. That was around 100 microparticles that we, again, put in a liter of water.
Great. And Shannon, I see a question for you in the chat. You might be able to answer in the chat. And let me just do Laura's question, and then we'll move on to Nick's presentation. And then again, there'll be time for questions after Nick's presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Urban Rich, for the presentation. I was curious about assigning a source to the micro particles that you're finding, particularly in the water column. And how is it possible to trace microplastics to their source? I know that polymer could be consistent with certain types of things, such as, tire fibers or maybe polyethylene. I guess I'm just confused because there's so many things that generate polyethylene particles or polypropylene. How can you trace it to a source? Is that done at the microscopic level, or is it done by sort of anecdotally assessing your surroundings and then seeing where it might come from?
So it can be done 2 ways. Some of it there right now is anecdotal, but in terms of like some of the polystyrenes, you can also look at some of the other chemicals that are in there. So your construction polystyrene has some other chemicals compared to your coffee cup. So we've looked at a little bit of that. And it's also with the FTIR, sometimes you can determine a little bit if there's enough other additives to be proprietary, you can figure out what it is.
Thank you. That's
So-
fascinating. And I should probably speak with you offline about that at some point. Thanks.
Sure, thanks, Laura.
All right, great. So we have one final presentation by Nick Warner, and Nick is going to be talking a little bit about what he and another student on here, Reese Reiling, and the Urban Harbors Institute is doing to help with the marine debris problem.
All right. Hi, everyone. Kim, you can see my screen all right?
Yes, looks good.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Nick Warner. I'm a master's student here at UMass Boston. I'm studying microplastics in Dr. Juanita Urban Rich's lab, as well as a research assistant with Urban Harbors Institute. And today I'll be sharing with you a project that we've been involved with for the past 1.5 years now, myself along with Kim Starbuck and Reese Reiling. And this project is called Regional Collaboration to Address Marine Debris in the Gulf of Maine. And this is a project that was developed from a grant that was awarded to the Gulf of Maine Association around November of 2021. And the goal was to create an international collaboration to address marine debris in the Gulf of Maine watershed. This project seeks to advance implementation of a 2019 action plan developed by NOAA and stakeholders. And the goals are reducing consumer debris, collaborating with industry to reduce impacts of derelict fishing gear, expand collaboration with recreational fisheries, reduce microplastics, and reduce and prevent impact to wildlife. And then below are all the project partners. And this project began in November 2021 and will end in September of this year. Now with UHI, our role has been to conduct coastal cleanups along the Massachusetts coast. And we've also been working with the Center for Coastal Studies that's based down in Provincetown, in the Cape. And we've also been assisting the Center for Coastal Studies in examining the presence and impacts of abandoned, lost, discarded fishing gear right here in the acronym. And based on the types of gear found, we are developing outreach guides, such as like field guides and fact sheets for boaters and fishers, and distributing that. Our cleanup contribution began around April of last year. And since then, we have hosted 14 cleanups along the coast in environmental justice communities, these communities being Salem, Nahant, South Boston, Dorchester, Quincy, Hull, and Marshfield. And overall, we've collected over 1,000 pounds of debris and engaged over 270 volunteers. And our cleanups have been advertised through social media channels, but we've also gotten in touch with local environmental organizations, residents, schools, and also our ever-growing email list. Now, along with that, we also want to increase and raise awareness. And the first way to do that is through the recreational boating and fishing communities. To do this, we helped the Center for Coastal Studies develop a field guide that highlighted ways to help. For example, ensuring that your trash receptacle and gear are secured on board, and then spreading awareness of microplastics. And we distributed this field guide at the New England Boat Show that was held at the Boston Convention and Exhibition Center in February of this year. We also want to engage the commercial fishing community. And to do this, we developed, or we didn't develop, but we helped to distribute a recently developed flyer that was developed with NOAA and the Center for Coastal Studies. And it's titled Inshore Fishery Debris Prevention Strategies. And not only did we disseminate this flyer at the boat show this year, but also we joined forces with the center and distributed these at commercial fishing docks, piers, and also harbor master offices in the North and South Shore. Yes, our cleanup collaboration. So we quickly realized when we began our cleanups in April of last year that joining forces with other groups is very beneficial. I learned that especially when I had a couple of cleanups where I was the only one in attendance. So we quickly reached out to local organizations and joined forces and created a lot of awesome collaborations. For example, with the Center for Coastal Studies, we had an early bird cleanup series that was very early in the morning on some weekdays in the summer of last year. We also collaborated with the Surfrider Massachusetts chapter, Keep Salem Beautiful for 3 Salem-based cleanups, UMass Boston's Alumni Association, and the OSLICE, or Office of Student Leadership and Community Engagement, for our Earth Day cleanups and Day of Action in October, and just recently the Neponset River and Watershed Association. So through these collaborations, we're able to engage more volunteers and make a bigger impact. Now, our best attended cleanup, and I'm very proud of this one, occurred on September 17th. This is when we collaborated with the Office of Coastal Zone Management for their state-sponsored Coast Sweep cleanup series. We held ours at Carson Beach and had 90 volunteers participate, and we removed around 400 pounds of debris. And the top debris types are glass bottles or pieces of glass, cigarette butts, food wrappers, and hard plastic and plastic bottle caps. And here we all are, donning our iconic mint green t-shirts. It was a wonderful day. I also want to point out how we've been tracking our data. So for each cleanup, we documented the types and amounts of debris that we find as best as we could. So each person would have not only a bucket with them for the debris, but also a clipboard with this data tracker sheet right here. And this was developed by the Center for Coastal Studies, just one sheet, and it's got a diverse amount of material, things like bottles, but both plastic and glass, things like PPE equipment, but even odder things like fireworks or shoes, or even shotgun shells. We also collected lobster trap tags. And the Center for Coastal Studies is keeping track of lobster trap tags. These are attached to lobster traps and have identifiable information on them so we can track them back to their owner. That's something that we do find often in our cleanups. Now, if we compile all of our data together, I'm not including April here because we used different data tracking sheets at the time, but from May of last year to December, the top 3 debris types are glass bottles or glass pieces, cigarette butts, and food wrappers. And I want to note, these are the same top 3 items that we also found in our single coast sweep event. So I find that very interesting. But continuing down, we also found prevalence of metal bottle caps, pieces of paper, plastic film, plastic bottles, pieces of foam, and alcoholic nips. Now, I'd also like to touch upon a very interesting find that occurred in the beginning of this project. The Center for Coastal Studies came upon this very odd yellow hollow cord that was washing up on the beaches. It would wash up in various lengths, as small as like a ½ inch to 5 feet, or even sometimes much longer. Like I found this at a beach in February last year, a huge clump of it, and that's my hand holding it at the bottom. So it was very enormous. Now, Laura Ludwig, she's the manager of the Marine Debris and Plastics program at the Center for Coastal Studies. She did some investigative work, and she discovered that it's called yellow shock tubing. And it was used during the Boston Harbor dredging project that ended early last year. And this yellow shock tubing was used for blasting. So she reached out to the Army Corps of Engineers, and they subsequently began monitoring the situation and the amounts that people were finding. Boston 25 News interviewed both Laura and I about this, and there's also a few other journals, news sources that reported this. So collection efforts not only were a lot found in the Cape, but also south of Boston, such as Hull and Quincy. So now this mystery is solved, but we have a new mystery piece of debris. We've been finding this. It looks kind of similar to the yellow shock tubing. However, it is not hollow. It's these square, hard plastic cables of different lengths, but usually they're found in this range of length with a quarter for scale of blue, green, or yellow colors. And they're usually frayed at one end. So if you have any idea or guess as to what this is, feel free to write in the chat what you think. Lastly, I'd like to mention this possible marine debris removal project. So this was identified by local artist in Hull, Jackie Rainey. She led a field trip for UHI staff down to this treasure trove of derelict fishing gear near Pemberton Point in Hull. So that's where we found these pictures on the right, large masses of derelict fishing gear, ropes, netting, lobster traps, so much stuff and so heavy that it's going to be a multi-day removal project, likely by boat with a crane. So this is something that we're keeping in the back of our minds for now. And I'd like to end with our upcoming Earth Day cleanup that Reese Reeling has put together. This is going to be on Earth Day at the Harbor Point lawn at UMass, starting at 9 a.m. And you can feel free to use this QR code, sign up. Any questions, let Reese know. But I hope to see you all there. And I'll pass it back off to Kim.
All right, great. Thank you, Nick. So we have just a couple minutes for questions. If you have questions, again, you can put them in the chat box. Just as a final closing, to join a sign up for cleanups around Massachusetts. That's our part of this project. You can email Reese, and her email address is up there. If you would like to hear more about upcoming webinars that we're going to be having on ocean and coastal topics, you can sign up for our newsletter. So the QR code at the bottom left is a direct link to our newsletter sign up. So you can sign up there, and you'll hear about future webinars, and then also what UHI is up to. And then if you have questions about research or community engagement, there are email addresses up there for Shannon, Juanita, and Nick. So thanks to all of our speakers, and wanted to open it up. We have a few minutes left for any questions.
I had a question.
Yes, Becky.
Hi. So was there any action taken when you guys found that this yellow tubing was coming from the dredging project? Like, is the Army Corps going to do anything about trying to reduce the amount that drifts away when they're doing the dredging? I'm from Newburyport, and I'm thinking we just had a big dredging project up here, and I'm wondering whether we're going to start seeing that up here.
Yeah, and I'm not the most knowledgeable about it. I know Laura Ludwig is here with us if she'd like to.
Yes,
If
she
you
has her hand raised.
Thanks for the question. It does beg the question. They are actually, there's a lot going on with it, and you will find it. I just found some in Cuttyhunk Island last week. It's everywhere. I found it in Buzzards Bay. And we are tracking it using a citizen science portal on ANIC data. So I encourage you to go to anicdata.org and find the explosive shock tubing observation recording area. It's the response has been super slow, as in like molasses uphill in January, but they are responding, and they have convened a working group that is a federal group that is working to change their protocols, but also to incorporate plastics as part of their EIS requirements for their, their plans as they put future blasting projects together. As I say, it's super slow. The other thing that's happening is I believe there's at least one lawsuit being brought against the Army Corps by the EPA. And I believe that Conservation Law Foundation is also looking into it. So there's a number of responses to the data that we have been able to secure about this particular debris item. And I'd be happy to keep people posted. If you're interested, you can reach out to Kim or Nick, and they can put you in touch with me. But the other thing is that I've been looking at that photo that Nick shared, and I really have no idea what those things are. So I can't wait for somebody to solve that mystery.
Yes, we were hoping somebody on this call might have an idea. Thank you, Laura. One final question. All right, well, not hearing from anyone, we just want to thank you all for joining again. We hope to stay in touch with you and hope to see you on future webinars. So thanks, everyone.